Welcome to Babies from Beyond, the podcast that gives all babies a voice, whether they are still in spirit or already earthside. I'm Lauren Dionysius, a former registered NICU nurse turned baby soul communicator, and I'm here to share the wisdom of today's babies to guide you on your motherhood journey. So my journey has been a wild ride, that's for sure. It's something that I never thought would be the way my life would go, but it seems my soul had other plans for my journey here on earth. So for those of you who don't know this, I worked as a registered nurse for 20 years and suddenly became a baby soul communicator when my science and spiritual worlds collided, literally on a night shift one night in a hospital's baby intensive care unit or NICU. So I'm going to share my journey in this episode that goes through these stages of a strict religious upbringing, unexpected childhood spiritual moments, an intense nursing career, and then two major spiritual awakenings that really did change everything for me. So going back into my childhood, I, like many in my generation, had a strict religious upbringing. We went to church every Sunday as a family. We went to a private Lutheran primary school, my siblings and I, and we always went to the youth groups, the camps, the confirmation classes. Every aspect of our life was centered around faith and the church. But when I look back on that time, there were a few little hints, I guess you could say, around a deeper spiritual connection that I had beyond what I was taught to believe in the church. One of these was, as a very young child, I was only 18 months and I burnt my hand helping my dad stack the fireplace. He looked away and I just took over and started putting the logs in the fire. And I remember being in the hospital afterwards, after going in the ambulance with burns to my hand, and I had a white bandage wrapped around my arm. I distinctly and clearly remember the purple lady. And that memory is so clear to me, like it was yesterday. And it was only a few years ago I was talking about this to my mum and I asked her who the purple lady was there. And she looked at me as if I had two heads. So in hindsight, she said there was no one else there. It was just me and your dad and the hospital staff. And I'm like, no, there was a purple lady. So in hindsight, I deeply believe that there was some kind of being, some kind of guide, even angelic being that was around me that I could clearly see and had no ability to determine what was 3D in this world and what wasn't. Another hint I had about a deeper spiritual connection while I was in childhood was imaginary friends. And again, imaginary friends are super common for kids. My imaginary friends were called Hikarika and Hoppy Bonky. I have no idea where those names come from, and neither do my parents, but I remember them and they were my friends. They were two friends who were very real to me, again, just as real as the purple lady. And I had these two friends until I was around 4 or 5 years of age and started going to school. And then my mum said they suddenly disappeared, which I think she was kind of relieved about because, here's this 5-year-old talking about these imaginary friends. So I think from then on, I don't remember having any other spiritual experiences. I think it was blocked or shut down because of religion, because of my schooling and education and friends, family, and just life in general. But I do remember being labeled as very quiet and very shy and not having the confidence really to share what I was thinking and what I was feeling, because I was a very curious child. I remember having a lot of questions, but I also remember not asking them either. And I think it was because I was so sensitive. I look back and the world and people in general just felt overwhelming to me and intimidating. And I didn't know how to articulate that. And I think back at that time in the 80s, there really wasn't the awareness to recognize that in children either. It was just, oh, you're too shy, you're too quiet. So I think that also in many ways shut down my curiosity for not just the world, but also the spirit world. And I would say that everything was kind of pretty shut down for me until my early 30s. So during this time, I became a nurse. I'd always wanted to be a nurse, and for as long as I could remember, I wanted to be a nurse and look after the babies. That didn't come from anywhere outside of myself. There was no one in my family who was a nurse. There was no one in my family who had a job looking after babies in any which way. It was something that seemed very unique to me and very internal to me, and it was something that really did not waver until my mid-teenage years, when I thought I might like to be a musician instead. I'd studied violin for many years, and I got into uni for both nursing and music. And just at the last minute, I decided to go down the nursing career path. So as I said, I'd always wanted to look after the babies. So as a general nurse, you cannot go straight into the nursery. You either had to become a midwife first, or you needed to do further training. And I'd never really been interested in birth or working with pregnant women or women in labor. It wasn't something that called to me. It was the babies. Like, the babies were what called me all through my childhood. And even if you look back through my childhood photo albums, they're literally filled with photos of me holding random babies. You know, just the babies of my parents' friends who would come over, or if we'd go places for a barbecue, there'd be photos of me holding these random babies. So it was something that was always in me from a very young age. So I was 23 when I finally had the opportunity to work in the nursery. It did mean doing more study, more training, and it was a challenging path. You know, working in the nursery, not only is there the shift work and a lot of technology and equipment to deal with, but it's a very emotional area of nursing to work in, you know, and I loved caring for the babies. That was something that I felt so fulfilled in, and I loved them. I loved caring for them. I loved to love them. I loved to change them and feed them and bath them and all of these things. But I really struggled emotionally and mentally, especially when it came time to rotate into the NICU, or the neonatal intensive care unit. That was really difficult for me, especially being very sensitive to the world anyway. Every day I was witnessing the suffering of these babies and their parents, the trauma they were going through, the intervention, and, you know, unfortunately for some, being the reality of an ICU is that not all babies survived, not all babies went home. So I was also dealing most days with the reality of death, and not just human death, but the death of babies, which for me was incredibly intense, and I really struggled with the justice in that. So it was a job, but it also was something that really weighed heavily on my heart, especially at around the 8-year mark, where I was just, I'm done. I cannot do this anymore. My work life was starting to suffer. I was feeling more stressed out. I was taking more sick leave. And so I thought, I need a break. I need to get away from this environment and I need to go and do something different. So I took what I call a career break and I traveled over to Africa. And little did I know that this journey for me would be the beginning of the opening into a whole new world and a whole new trajectory for my life. Because until this point in 2011, I was very much in the science world, very left-brained, very black and white, very right and wrong. I'd moved away from the church at this point because I struggled with some of the dogma and the teachings there that just did not feel aligned for me. But I was still very much disconnected, I would say, from the spirit world. So over in Africa, I had an experience. It was something that I saw as a whitewater rafting accident at the time when I was traveling through Zambia, where I fell out of the raft and fell into the water. And I don't know what that period of time was, but I knew I couldn't breathe. And what happened is I felt like I split in two. I could feel my body in the water. I could feel myself being bashed up against rocks and logs, and I could feel my body hurting because of that. I could feel the panic of not being able to breathe, mostly because I didn't know which way was up. I didn't know where the top of the water was. I was completely disorientated in the water. I didn't know which direction I was facing. I was just being pulled or pushed very quickly by the water. And I just felt like, why isn't anybody saving me? Like, I feel like I've been gone for minutes or who knows how long it was. So that was one part of my experience. The other part of my experience was outside of my body. I was above my body and I was looking down at my body. I could see my body in the water. I had the experience of being in two places at once. And the other part of me was above me. I was in a dark room. There was no people around me. And all I saw was what looked like a TV on the wall. And I started seeing all different times of my life, people in my life, my family, my friends, my school, from when I was younger, a lot of scenes from my childhood and also from my adulthood to that point. It was very random. It was very fast. It was very confusing. I just remember being confused. Like, why am I having all these memories? Why are they all coming up now? There was a confusion there for me, but there was also a lot of fear and this knowing like, I'm going to die. Like, if I don't breathe, I'm going to die was the feeling. And so, again, I don't know how long I was in this space for. And then at one point I heard a voice. I didn't see anyone in that dark room because it was dark. I just heard a voice that said, it's not time. You need to go back for the babies. You need to go back for the children. And I had no idea what that meant. There were no children in my life other than my little niece, who was about 8 at the time. I thought maybe I needed to go back for her for some reason. Because as far as I was concerned, I was done with the nursery and with NICU and with nursing. And then suddenly I was rescued by this big African guy on a kayak, and he paddled me to the side of the valley that we're in, where we were having this rafting experience. And I, at the time, was very physically exhausted and sore, but I was just running on adrenaline. And I was hyperventilating. I couldn't breathe properly. I had a lot of water in my mouth. I was coughing and spluttering. And eventually, when they tried to get me to get back on another raft and I said, no, I'm out of here, they took me back to the campground. Now, as a nurse, the nurse in me put that down to a panic attack. I thought I'd fallen out of the raft. It was something that I was afraid of before I even got in the raft. And then it happened, and just all this fear, all this anxiety came up. So my science brain told me that I just had a panic attack and anxiety. And that was what I put it down to for the next few years. I would say probably the next 8 years at least, maybe longer. And I hadn't had any exposure to near-death experiences. I didn't know anything about the life review or the life flashing before your eyes. I had no prior understanding of that. So I'm going to park that experience there for the moment because I want to come back to that soon. Because when I finished my time in Africa and returned to Australia, I had to find work. I hadn't worked for many months, and I knew nursing, so I went back into nursing, but I decided I can't go back to the babies. It was something that I still really struggled with. I hadn't really unpacked my experiences in the nursery yet. So I started working in a private hospital in the operating room, which is something I'd done very early in my career. And I was working in orthopedics, I was working in plastics and reconstructive surgery, and so it was in a hospital too where there was no obstetrics, so they didn't deliver babies there. So I also didn't have to come across anything to do with babies. So I happily worked in the operating room for about 3 years or so. And then I started to feel that familiar yearning to work with the babies again. And I dismissed it because I'm like, well, I didn't cope with it last time, and I can't keep running to Africa whenever I can't deal with my job. So I resisted that call for a while, and then I slowly started to ease my way back into it. But I gave the universe an ultimatum. It's like, if I'm going to go back to the nursery, if I'm supposed to go back, then things need to be different. Because by this point, not long after I returned to Africa, interestingly, I started to be more curious about spirituality. I started dabbling in yoga and meditation and breath work and these things, which I hadn't been into at all before I went to Africa. So I didn't realize at the time, but it was only in hindsight that I can now see how that experience in Africa, even though I didn't know that it was a near-death experience at that time, it still changed my interests. It still changed my trajectory on some level. So eventually, as I said, I returned to the nursery. I worked mostly with well babies to start with, avoiding the NICU for as long as I could, until eventually I felt the call to get back into the NICU and caring for the sickest babies. And as I said, I gave the universe an ultimatum. Things need to be different. So note to self, be careful what you ask for. And within a few months of returning to the nursery, I started having these experiences that I couldn't explain. Remember, even though I was dabbling in some spiritual modalities, I was still very much in my science left brain. But I remember one night in the NICU, and it was about 2 or 3 in the morning. I was tired. I felt sick in the stomach. I just wanted to sleep, and I was working with a baby in isolation because she had an infection, and she was very unsettled. I'd done everything. I'd fed her, I'd changed her, I'd cuddled her. I'd done all of the things that I could think of to do at 2 o'clock in the morning on a night shift. And what happened is I went to put her dummy in her mouth to help soothe her, settle her. There was a big part of me that just wanted her to be quiet, because if she was quiet, then I could sit down and rest. So I popped her dummy in her mouth, or a pacifier for those who don't know what a dummy is. That's my Australian slang. And then something happened in that moment, and it was very similar to the experience in Africa in many ways in the water, and that it's like everything froze and I was having 2 different experiences. So there was me, Lauren, as the nurse at 2 or 3 in the morning on a night shift at this particular hospital. And then there was this other part of me that was seeing something else. And when I say that, what I saw was an image or a picture around this baby's cot. It was just a head. It didn't have a body, and it looked like a cartoon character. It looked a bit like Elmer Fudd. And this happened when I put the dummy or the pacifier in that baby's mouth, trying to settle her. There was this realization that something else was going on and that she was communicating with me, and she was communicating through this image. And the image showed this cartoon character, or Elmer Fudd, with a bemused look on his face. It was a mixture of both shock and amusement. And I realized instantly in that time that I had shut this baby down. She was trying to communicate with me. She was trying to share something with me. She was trying to move something through her little body. And I was trying to shut that down with her dummy. I wanted her to be something she wasn't in that moment. And all of these words were going through my mind simultaneously. And then there was the realization from the baby in the cot with her eyes wide looking at me. And then I realized that she knew what was going on. And so it was just this really weird experience that did not make any sense to me. Well, the human me. But there was a deeper part of me that's like, wow, I just shut her down. I tried to change her. I didn't accept her as she was. I was telling her she wasn't okay, or that she wasn't able to cry, that she wasn't able to talk to me in the only way that she knew how. So there was all of these things, and then there was a feeling of guilt for me. I was like, oh my God, like what have I done to this baby? And then along with the thoughts of, oh my God, I'm just going mad. I've done too many night shifts. I haven't had enough sleep. I need some time out. I'm stressed, and now I'm starting to hallucinate. So I did what my left brain told me to do, which was to take time off, to not say anything to anybody, and to take some time off work and rest up and eat properly and chill. So that's what I did. I took, I think it was a couple of weeks off work, and, came back to work, felt better, felt more rested, a little bit nervous about coming back to work. But when I returned, it just kept happening with different babies in different ways, different images, different experiences. Sometimes it was visual. Sometimes it was through words and hearing. Other times I was getting feelings in my body, in my stomach, in my chest that would often correlate with physical symptoms or conditions that these babies would have that would later come out on scans and x-rays and ultrasounds and things like that. So it was starting to freak me out a little bit. And I continued to ignore it. I just pretended it wasn't happening and that it was just my imagination, that I was just overthinking things. And so I just ignored it. But then after a year or so, it wasn't going away. And I realized that it was getting louder and it was happening on every shift now, not just the occasional shift. And I thought maybe I should start listening a little bit more instead of blocking it or pushing it away. And so once I allowed that and started listening and looking and feeling what was going on, it just got crazier from there, my experiences. And I will talk more about these in coming episodes. To summarize, these babies became my biggest teachers. They taught me all about their world through their eyes. They helped me to understand their life in a NICU and their feelings around that, how they were dealing with that. But the biggest thing they taught me was to understand that there's a bigger picture here. It's not just as simple as a baby being born onto the earth and here they are in the NICU in a cot looking up at me. It was about the soul coming to the earth to be a little human, what they were here to experience and what they were here to learn about and what they were here to grow through. They also taught me to question my beliefs about babies being these clueless, innocent little beings who knew nothing about anything and couldn't communicate, to these wise, mature, incredibly powerful, awake and aware beings of spirit who knew so much more than I ever did about life on earth. They taught me to question my beliefs around life and death, and really helped me to understand their journey and their world and how I could support them in a much deeper way, well beyond the physical. So this journey for me, it all unfolded piece by piece, baby by baby, month by month, year by year, until suddenly I had all of these stories. I literally had journals full of all of these stories and experiences from my time as a NICU nurse. I never shared these experiences with anyone, which meant that I had to look like a normal registered NICU nurse doing my job while also having these other experiences alongside my clinical role. So it was definitely a juggling act, and I'm sure I probably came across bizarre to some people with some of the things that I may have said. But I learned so much, and babies were and still are my biggest teachers, and I just have so much respect for their journey and their decisions and their choice to make that trip to Earth. So about 3 or 4 years, I want to say, after I returned to the nursery following Africa, I had 3 shared death experiences, which were actually the beginning of the end of my nursing career for me. And these shared death experiences with the babies I cared for, it was 3 different babies over maybe 18 months, I think. It was like pulling back the veil and witnessing what was happening behind the scenes when a soul is preparing to leave the body and return to spirit. Now, I'd had a lot of exposure to death also in my childhood with friends and relatives, but also early in my nursing career, even while I was still at university, part of my training and clinical hours involved working in hospitals where patients died. So I'd had a lot of exposure to death, and it was something I had a lot of fear around. And so, as I said, when I came into the nursery, working with babies or caring for babies who were dying was a whole other level of challenge for me. But these shared death experiences really helped me to see that process and understand the death process in a very different way, in a way that was very joyful, very freeing, and very peaceful, which was the energy that I got from these 3 babies I cared for, where I was able to witness their journey. Again, this sense of being separate to my human self that was witnessing the very clinical experience of the death of a baby. But I was being able to see and lean behind the veil and see what was actually happening, see what beings were there to support them, feeling the soul and their journey as they left the earth. I'll talk more about these experiences in other episodes, so I'm going to park that there. What I want to say, just to finish up this episode, is that they taught me so much. What they taught me changed my life, not just clinically with how I spoke to them, how I cared for them, how I touched them, how I held them, but also personally. They taught me a level of understanding about being on the earth, and about life and about death, that allowed me to keep working in this area of nursing for many years after returning from Africa. And while witnessing the pain and the trauma of babies and their parents, as well as the loss of babies in the nursery, still broke my heart. The wisdom that they shared with me before, during, and after they left their little bodies or were put on a ventilator and separated from their parents, all of these things, this wisdom and this guidance really helped to soften the edges of my heart and soften that pain didn't make it go away, but it helped me to see a different perspective and soften that really intense heartbreak that I was feeling. But while it completely changed my life, I wasn't the person who needed this information the most. It was the parents of the babies I was caring for. And I actually have a lot of guilt around this. If I could have shared the wisdom that these babies were sharing with me, if I could have shared that with their parents, I know that it would have changed them and it would have changed their experiences of having a baby in the NICU, just as it did for me. Probably even more so because it was their baby, their child. But I couldn't share anything. I was in a very professional, regulated role with rules and codes of conduct and policies and procedures and things you could do and things you couldn't do. And imagine if I'd started telling parents about what their baby was telling me. Imagine not only the parents' response, especially if they weren't open to it, but imagine that getting back to my colleagues or my boss. Like, that was what made me keep everything to myself. I'd be sent off on stress leave. I'd be sent off to the mental health unit or who knows. So I was able to keep it to myself until I couldn't. And that was back in 2021 when I left the hospital system altogether. There were many reasons for this, but at the end of the day, I just couldn't do it anymore. It was becoming more and more misaligned between me and my experiences and what I was experiencing from these babies and how the hospital cared for these babies and treated them and saw these babies. It was just like black and white for me. It was so like chalk and cheese. It was so grating on my nervous system, on my soul, on my human self. And as I said, at the end of the day, I needed to be able to share this wisdom with the people who needed to hear it most, and that was their parents. So having been out of the system now for 3 going on 4 years now, I'm now able to fully and wholeheartedly, without censoring myself, share this wisdom and help parents and women to understand their journey in a different way, understand their babies in a different way, while helping to bridge that space between science and spirit. I'm still very left-brained. I just have this whole other side now that is waking up in me and is growing and expanding. And for me, I believe it's a combination of both. Like, we don't have to shut out one to embrace the other and vice versa. So I have a healthy respect still for the medical system, but it's just, I know it's not where I need or want to be at this time. So now it's about connecting women with their baby's soul and helping them to trust their own intuition so that they can connect more deeply with their own baby's wisdom, whether their baby is still in spirit, whether they are on their way during pregnancy, or whether they are already babies and even children on the earth. So yeah, it's been a wild ride, that's for sure, but I wouldn't change a thing. This journey has shown me that baby souls have so much to share if we're willing to listen, and that is my whole purpose and passion around doing this podcast and sharing their wisdom with you who are willing and brave enough to listen. Thank you for tuning in to Babies from Beyond. If you've enjoyed this episode, I'd love for you to leave me a review just wherever you listen to your podcasts. Also, head over to Instagram and give me a follow at Born Energy, and check out the show notes for more ways that you can connect with your baby's soul, including one-on-one readings and online programs to support you. Until next time, trust your journey and your baby. Take care.